All right. Well, thank you, Sana. Thank you to Fernwood. My name is Andy Crosby. Um, I'm tuning in from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin land here in so-called Gatineau, Quebec, across the river from so-called Ottawa, Ontario, and the so-called National Capital Region. So I'm really appreciative for this opportunity, and thank Fernwood for organizing, as well as this great panel of participants, and then everyone who signed in today. So I really appreciate that. Really excited about this panel. So I've either participated in or observed events with most of you. I'm looking forward to learning more about what's going on in your communities. So in my 5 or so minutes here to kind of lead this discussion, I think I'll just talk a bit about resisting eviction, and kind of maybe how I came to that, and kind of contextualizing a bit. So this is a book that was published based on the research I did during my Ph.D. And now I never went into the Ph.D. thinking I was going to be writing about this at all. I had proposed to do research on settler colonial policing, coming off the heels of publishing Policing Indigenous Movements with Fernwood in 2018, as Sana mentioned. But in the years leading up to that in Ottawa, I was involved with different social justice groups, in particular the Leveler newspaper and the Ontario Public Interest Research Group. And through these connections was how I got connected with folks at Herongate. I'll talk a bit about Herongate in a second for those who are unfamiliar. But tenants there were doing a really effective job at reaching out for potential allies and to bring people into their struggle, that could provide support and various tools to resist eviction. So they had reached out to various people, including myself and others who I was working with. So I was involved in independent media, and I had quite a few years of experience doing access to information or freedom of information research. And basically, that's how I got involved in the spring, summer of 2018. So at that time, we wanted to figure out what was going on through this mass eviction. I will tell you what has happened there, but there's this mass eviction happening. We wanted to figure out who was kind of pulling the strings behind this. So we wanted to understand the municipal angles. We wanted to learn more about the landlord, this financialized real estate investment firm, Timber Creek Asset Management, that had recently purchased this entire neighborhood. And so I wasn't thinking about this in terms of an academic angle or publishing a book or anything like that. To me, that didn't seem to be an effective way to approach this, because we were looking at a small window of time, and with the ultimate goal to keep people in their homes. That was the ultimate goal. It wasn't to do academic research, which takes years and years usually to do and to publish and to just disseminate knowledge through those various venues. So we were looking for kind of immediate results. So Timber Creek had issued eviction notices in May 2018 for over 100 households to move out by the end of September. So that's what we were working with at the time. It was only when the landlord Timber Creek, this big multi-billion-dollar firm, kind of went on the offensive. They attacked the Herongate Tenant Coalition. The coalition was a group of tenants who came together to try to keep people in their homes, mobilize the community. So Timber Creek attacked coalition through Twitter, and that kind of resonated with my academic work, where I began to think about it in these types of terms. So it's just I've written about this in media and it's in the book, but it's worth rehashing because it's still striking for me, that Timber Creek went on the offensive against the coalition through legal means, through attempted legal means, through Twitter. So the coalition was doing this really effective mobilizing work and research and shedding light on the human actors involved in this mass eviction, city officials, executives of this company, and they were kind of exposing what they were doing through social media. So that really pissed off the landlord, who went to Twitter with their lawyers and letters and said, listen, we need you to permanently disable the Herongate Tenant Coalition's Twitter account. And if you don't, you are facilitating criminal activity, which there was no criminal activity happening. There was never any, no crimes being committed. There was never any arrest or charges or anything around this entire struggle. But moreover, The coalition members, according to the landlord, claiming to Twitter that the members were unstable, this is quote unquote, unstable, unhinged, and extremist. So I found this incredibly dirty and interesting, and that it aligned with my research on policing and insecurity governance that is labeled Indigenous land defenders and environmental activists as extremists, attempting to delegitimize their work, their efforts against resource extractive industries. So anyway, that's kind of how the seeds of the book were sown. So I'm forever grateful to the Herongate Tenant Coalition and others I've worked with in the community, as well as the academic infrastructure that kind of came after. So the people that supported me through that degree, and to see it through to the end, and of course Fernwood's wonderful team, which helped convert that large document into hopefully a digestible, accessible, more accessible than a PhD dissertation book. So I probably ate up most of my minutes, but of course, I wanted to, if you're not familiar with the struggle, at Herongate, I want to give just a quick synopsis of a very complex trajectory of events that has gone on there. So very quick, 2012 and 2013, this company, Timber Creek Asset Management, they've since rebranded or repositioned themselves. They're now known as Hazelview Investments. And according to me and my observations, I think that they've only done this, or they've repositioned themselves based on the intense resistance that they've and running their brand internationally through the mud for what they've been doing in Ottawa and Toronto and elsewhere. The tenant organizing and mobilizing has been really effective in shedding a public spotlight on the actors behind these mass eviction gentrification efforts and the financialization of rental housing. So Timber Creek / Hazelview, obtained the Herongate neighborhood in Ottawa in 2012 and 2013, and a couple small purchases, a couple $100 million for this, a few dozen hectare neighborhood, home to thousands of tenants, hundreds of townhomes, low-rise, medium-rise, high-rise buildings. Thousands of people live there. It's a majority racialized neighborhood, and the majority earn below average incomes compared to the Ottawa income average. Lots of immigrants and refugees settle in Herongate, particularly from East Africa and the Middle East. These hundreds of townhome units, which are all slated for demolition, they're 3 to 4 bedroom townhomes. They have a front and backyard. They intergenerational families can live in these large households, in these large homes. So Timber Creek is developed a master plan targeting all the townhomes in the community and the low and mid-rise buildings, all going to be torn down according to their plan, redevelop the entire neighborhood with some 50 towers, bringing in thousands and thousands of people and kind of changing the neighborhood, bringing in, kicking out the people that are there, bringing in people that can pay higher rents. So in 2016, it tore down 80 townhomes, and again in 2018, another 150. So there have been 2 mass evictions there. The Herongate Tenant Coalition mobilized in 2018 to attempt to stop the evictions. They were ultimately unsuccessful. Their efforts, however, have had lasting implications. An ongoing implication, one of the forcing them to reposition themselves, according to me, but they've also forced the company to commit to no more displacement in future demolitions and compelled city officials to actually kind of enforce this new quote unquote social contract for the community, which we could talk about. It's a complicated thing, but and the Herongate Tenant Coalition opposes any redevelopment. So they oppose any master plan that will knock down, continue to force people out of their homes. But the company has promised to not displace any more people in the community. So there no more evictions, no more people being expulsed and dispersed from the neighborhood. This according to them. So that's significant, but the coalition still opposes any future demolitions, any more loss of affordable homes and housing in the neighborhood, contributing to the wider gentrification of the neighborhood. And critically, there's still no justice for those who've already been displaced, and some of which have filed a claim with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. They're seeking a right to return to the neighborhood. So this is an important case that's ongoing. It's still playing out. It'll take years, but it could set a precedent if they're able to return to the neighborhood and they somehow can win this case. So that's kind of a snippet of what's happened there, and a drawn out and complex ongoing struggle. And I think what's happening there, we can look at Herongate as a microcosm of what's happening across the country in terms of these predatory types of real estate firms targeting people and their homes as an asset class. But I can expand on that. I'm sure I'm out of time. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Andy. I'll just briefly introduce us to Ricardo. Ricardo Tranjan, Ph.D., is a political economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and author of the national bestseller, The Tenant Class, which was published with Between the Lines in 2023. Welcome, Ricardo.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for hosting this event. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Andy, for writing a great book. I published that book last year and been doing lots of talks about that. So naturally, I was reading the book and kind of like, in my head, Ren and Andy, we're like best friends because I read your book. We're having all of these dialogues with what I've been doing and so on and so forth. So a couple of my comments, it's in that context. But also my day job, I work for a think tank, so I'm involved in this say more mainstream debates and about housing policy and in the media and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like where I come at this from as well. So just kind of 4 quick things that I really appreciate in the book. First one is in the way it challenges the notion of crisis, right? We hear a lot about the housing crisis. I challenge that in my work, but in a very structural way. Right? I'm kind of like an economist, and I say like this is how the market it is, and this is how markets work, and this is the dynamics and so on. And I find it really interesting how the book presents in a more dynamic way as that ongoing and ever repeating domiciled process, right? And in which certain population groups, pretty much always the same, have to move to make space for whatever capital have in mind for that particular piece of land, and that repeats itself. And then when you can think even in terms of beyond the lifespan of one generation, when you think about overtime, you can see this certain population groups that are always susceptible to that, have always been susceptible to that, to being pushed, to being and relocated somewhere else to make room for something new and pretty that someone's going to make a lot of money off. Especially the example with the LeBron flats and how that's where it starts, and then that people get pushed, and then over the years and decades they manage to build a community that is a safe space for themselves, and then capital now wants to move there, so they have to relocate. I found that really interesting as a way of thinking of the so-called crisis and how it's constantly pushing people in through this process that Andy used Domicide to kind of to explain. The other piece that I found very interesting in comparison to other work is how he talks about the landlord when he goes on the offensive, exactly like the tactics of the landlords. We have a little bit, definitely not enough, but a little bit of work on tenant organizing and the tactics of tenants and the different strategies. But we have even fewer work on how landlords respond and how they are not how they're very actively engaged in concerted actions to stop resistance, to undermine resistance. And of course, if you think about Toronto right now, where we have more than 600 tenants on strike, we know that there is a lot of that going on right now, of very concerted action and some of the same tactics. So I found it very rich to see that document and laid out. It's certainly something that I'll be pointing to quite a bit. And now sort of like moving more to the kind of like my policy brain. Another thing that I found interesting, quite interesting in the book is that in the public discourse around housing these days, never mind the sort of mainstream debate, which like is all about supply and demand, we don't have enough housing and that's why it's expensive. But even if you move to what would be seen as more progressive takes on this, there's often going to be an emphasis on governments not being on governments neglecting housing. So there's a narrative about how, you know, the federal government stopped funding public housing, how the federal government stopped providing incentives to purpose-built apartment buildings, and then since then we haven't built enough. We need to get back into that. So it's often, you know, centered around the notion of federal and provincial governments not doing enough, and they need to get back into the game. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the book is how it shows the city government being an active part of the process of pushing tenants out, and how the city, and I think it's not unique to the case of Water, in the case of Huron Gate, how cities are often seen as, you know, the government that has little fiscal capacity and much fewer tools to engage in housing and so on, so they can't do that much. But this book kind of shifts that paradigm a little bit and showing the city doing quite a bit, just not on the right side of things. And I think it's a reminder of the role of the state, not only as a proactive benevolent states that could come and intervene and be more active to help to solve the so-called housing crisis, but this is the state acting directly as an enforcer and as a facilitator for the needs and for the pressures that capital is pushing onto people. So that part I really appreciated. And then perhaps the last thing that like I've been talking to friends and colleagues in various spheres about how to continue this work, and my shorthand call is for people to do more work for movements and not about movements. That's something that I say often, and not only referring to the tenant movement, but referring to other causes as well. Because there's kind of like a tradition, I think, in academia to write about these movements and describe what they are, and there's entire literatures about social movements and so on. And I find that often it's quite less helpful for the movements themselves, right? That kind of work. And then I've been having these conversations with some friends and some colleagues and saying, what does it mean to work for and with movements instead of about them? You know, movements don't need to tell them what they're doing; they know it, right? Like they want something that they can use to advance their struggle. I think the book provides some really great not only insights, you know, kind of in some of the more methodological chapters that kind of explains the process, but also overall just kind of an example. So in that part I also really appreciate. So yeah, so I think for me those are the four things that jump a bit: the challenging of housing crisis through that concept of domicide, the empirical work on the tactics of landlords and undermining resistance, the showing of the city and governments more broadly as an actor enforcing and advancing the capitals of the projects of capital, and then this part about doing research with and for and not about movements. So yeah, that's my take. That's one of my favorite things in this piece of work.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Ricardo. I'll just take a moment now to introduce Vince. Vince Tao was born in Scarborough, Ontario, and lives in Vancouver, BC. He works as a community organizer at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, also known as VANDU. Prior to this, he worked as a labor organizer at Simon Fraser University and as an educator and librarian in Vancouver's Chinatown. Tao is also a member of the Our Homes Can't Wait coalition and the hashtag Stop the Sweeps Vancouver. Welcome, Vincent.
Hey everyone, my name is Vince. Thank you so much for inviting me today, the organizers, and also Andy for your great book. I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Again, thank you so much for having me. Great book, gotta say. Thank you for the introduction, Sana. And I'm also a member of the Tenants Union. So this book is very useful, I would say, for people that are going to get into fights inevitably over your building getting demolished, like much like the one that I'm actually zooming in from at the moment. I'm not gonna dox myself too much, but I currently live in like 100-year-old apartment building. My rent is extremely low. I've lived here for about 6 or 7 years. My rent for one bedroom is under $900. That's in Vancouver, folks. So like I'm like clinging on to the radiator here until they knock the place down. But it's an important object lesson because like I mean a lot of folks, I've been doing tenant organizing work for a bit, and a lot of people, I mean, they think about the tenant struggle in certain ways. A lot of it through, let's say, traditional means of like what we call the tenant landlord social contract, right? Enshrined in various legislations, like for here in BC, the Residential Tenancy Act. And it's like an important way to think about the struggle, because it kind of like it's a nexus for thinking about the rights of the tenant versus the rights of the landlord, mediated by the government essentially through the residential tenancy branch. But it all depends on this kind of like a presumption of like the usual tenant landlord relation or contract, which is I pay rent to a guy who owns the property, and in return, the guy who gets my rent will fix up the place so that typically he can continue to extract rents from me forever, right? And that's the normal relation here. And through the RTA and the RTB, tenants can, pulling, like tactics and strategies from the labor movement, from the tenant movement as well, and historically, to fight for their rights collectively, right? Through this arena mediated by the government, i.e. the RTB. Only thing is, all of that goes out the window when the building reaches the end of its life, let's say. And rather than try to extract rent from me forever, which is what I would prefer, I guess, the landlord's going to sell this building and destroy it. And then, as Andy Crosby would say in his book, intensify the building and turn the site into maximum profit extraction at maximum highest best use according to the state and the economy, i.e. building a gigantic condominium on top of it. And that's exactly what's going to happen here, right? So I am only 2 minutes away from Main and Broadway, where they're currently drilling a gigantic hole in the ground to make a subway station. And if you have been paying attention to BC politics, there was just a provincial bill passed just in December saying they're going to rezone all of BC. It's called transit-oriented development, to make sure that there's essentially going to be a blast site from every metro station that says, if you're within 200 meters, 400 meters to 800 meters, there's going to be a minimum development of 20 stories high condominium. So exactly where I am, which is like maybe a 16-unit, a 100-year-old building at affordable rents, will eventually, because of this legislation, be turned into a 20-story condo minimum, right? And at that point, the social contract, to go back to what I was talking about, the social contract just flies out the window. It's just like the landlord doesn't give a shit. I have a hole that just opened up in my ceiling right there that's just been dripping water for like the last couple of days. And guess what? Because the landlord's going to tear down my building, there's no incentive for them to fix that hole, like ever at this point, right? Because I don't, they want me to leave, essentially. It makes it a lot easier for them to demolish this building. And so I think this is all to say that this is a very important book for tenant organizers because, of course, dem evictions always loom in the mind, but to really consider that this is the big next step, especially with gigantic rezonings provincial-wide, like the Transit-Oriented Development Bill, we're going to see a lot of buildings go down completely, right? And of course, in that time, as documented in Andy's book, is that the tenants in these buildings will have to struggle on a new kind of terrain that is not based on a social contract between landlord and tenant. It's people trying to survive their complete destruction of their homes, the domicide. And I think that that's, for me, what was really exciting about this book is the introduction of that term, at least to me. I hadn't thought about that term before. Domicide being the deliberate murder and destruction of home, right? And I think that's a term that we should be thinking about a lot more, especially in the Canadian context, where, again, Andy's book does a really great job of introducing all of this in the kind of longue durée of the colonial project, right? And this is why it's really, really important to see what, whether it's in this book, it's called the kind of municipal developer nexus. It's been also theorized as a real estate state, the importance of government as an active engine in this kind of domicide is very important, stretching from the colonial beginnings of so-called Canada, when the country was essentially just like a company with a state attached to it. That the destruction of homes, whether it's Indigenous people's homes or now contemporarily still Indigenous people's homes, but also poor and working class people's homes, is actually, I think, a very important engine of the kind of destruction to come for tenants everywhere. And I think especially in the context, and thank you, Sana, for mentioning this, is that domicide also powerfully links what is going on in a settler colonial state like Canada in terms of gentrification, destruction via gentrification, to what we see in Gaza at the moment, right? Just domicide on a mass industrial spectacular scale. And it may seem like a reach to kind of connect these two instruments, but I think it's not that big of a leap, right? In the sense that there's one way to see what is going on in Gaza is as precisely a similar logic as a crisis of accumulation, right? Is like capitalism always reaches these natural kind of or organic kind of blocks or ends to how much money it can extract from a certain thing or place or people. And once it reaches that end, it needs to create new space physically, a lot of times, to extract more money, right? And Gaza is a place where both the United States war machine and the Israeli war machine and economy have run out of places to make money, and so they have a captive population, a captive territory to completely raze and destroy and flatten, as we've seen barbarically in video. That is a way of flattening ground to rebuild, and you're seeing that as well. They just had a conference in Israel of people, dancing around, being excited about resettling and essentially gentrifying Gaza, like turning it into a new, luxury hotel and condominium space for Israeli settlers and Zionist settlers. So, I think that to use domicide as a kind of way to see how there is a really powerful linkage here in settler colonial states, being flattened and destroyed to create new cycles of accumulation through new cycles of settlement and development. This is a really powerful way to kind of connect struggles and see that this is part of the kind of imperial logic of settler colonialism. I see Sana's hands up, so I'm gonna end off there. But lots of rich stuff to talk about, and appreciate the time to talk about it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vance. Thank you sincerely so much for those wonderful remarks. I will pass it on now to AJ. AJ Withers organized with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for over 20 years, including as a paid organizer. They are the author of Fight to Win, Inside Poor People's Organizing, A Violent History of Benevolence, Interlocking Oppression in the Moral Economies of Social Working, with Chris Chapman, and numerous other articles and book chapters. They are the Ruth Wynn Woodward Jr. Chair in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. Welcome, AJ.
Thank you so much. And I also want to begin by congratulating you, Andy, on this really great feat. This is a really great book, and it's hard to write a book. And also, Congratulations to everyone around you who helped and who supported you in that, because I know that it's not a solitary, even though it feels like it a lot of times, it's not a solitary project. The book opens with this really lovely kind of telling of your mom's story, and as a way of introducing us to settler colonialism and how all of us who don't own property are always in a precarious position, and the way that we can become more secure is by becoming better, more entrenched settlers. And I felt like that was a really, really useful lesson and an important framing for the book. And the book carries settler colonialism throughout. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick today. And in a really central way that I think is really important, but that there's this sort of fundamental tension for everyone who's a tenant, that the only way to become more secure is to further commit injustice against other people if you're a settler on these lands. And so much of the way that real estate is structured in this country is so fundamentally unjust, obviously centering settler colonialism. One of the things that I really appreciate about the text is that it, like Ricardo was saying, it doesn't look at studying the activists. It starts from the question of like, how do things work? And that's one of the things that's really useful about political activist ethnography, which is a pretty obscure methodology. I'm just going to dork out for 1 minute. It's something that is really useful for people who are scholars as a way of being able to contribute to movements, to begin from the standpoint of activism, look out and be like, how do we understand from where we're looking? How do we understand how things work? And it's a way of being able to use that standpoint instead of looking at people, trying to figure out how stuff works. And this is a really excellent example of it. And it's a way of also not having to deal with the, like Ricardo was saying, pretty awful body of social movement literature that is, I'm being a bit harsher, but is typically often useless and obvious. And this book helps activists and tenants and everyone understand financialization in a really accessible manner, which I think a lot of people have a really hard time getting their heads around how financialization really works and how it impacts all of our daily lives. And one of the reasons for that is because of just beginning from this really simple position. How does this work? And finding out then how landlords are acting. Instead of just looking at activists, you don't see how the landlords are acting in the same way. Or you get like ideas about or beliefs about how landlords are acting. And the folks who are the activists in this neighborhood, they really say like, we're going to be the activists. We're not going to be organized from outsiders. And that's such a respected position in the book and such a lovely position in organizing. There's often this sort of tension between vanguardists who believe they have the answers already and people that recognize that they don't. Quick tip, the answer is that you don't have the answers. And if you believe that you do have the answers, you're a jerk. And it's a really good way to go into a community and cause a lot of harm and not listen to the people that you say that you're working in solidarity with. And so the tenants begin from that point of like, we are the community and we have the answers and we're not going to take other people coming in and telling us what to do, I think is a really important thing to make clear in the book, that folks can do this on their own and other people may or may not support, but people can really organize on their own. And one of the dangers of writing a book like this is that people will read it and then think that they have the answer. and then think that they can apply it elsewhere. And so I think it's really important for people to remember, just like reading a book or two doesn't mean that you have the answer. It's always really important what context you're in and taking the leadership of the people who are experiencing the injustice. One of the things that, as I was reading the book, I was just hearing the echoes of Africville and Regent Park throughout. And then Andy gets to talking about those two particular sites, and which is a bit, there's like so many more sites, but they were very much in my head, and then they came into the paper. And these particular injustices that happen over and over and over again, especially to racialized groups of displacement, to create space for capital and the state facilitating it. I think it's important to understand that when people ask, how do we make the state work for us? That stories like this show that the state doesn't ever work for us. The state is always working in the interest of capital. And we can fight for the things that we need, but we always have to fight. The state's never going to come to our side. The state is always going to be oppositional to us. And if we ever kind of lose track of that and begin to become complicit, we've already lost. So I am really excited to have a conversation with folks. So I'll leave it there and look forward to chatting with people.
Wonderful. I'm just going to spotlight all of our panelists. There we go. And then I guess maybe to begin, it would be really wonderful to just hear all of your responses to each other's remarks, maybe in the order that you spoke. Andy, if you want to begin.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really humbled by the remarks, and so appreciative of people taking the time to read the book and then thoughtfully engaging with it. And yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can talk about. I like what I guess I was struck by what all you were saying, but Vince as well, talking about your building and showing your building and talking about reaching the end of the life cycle, and it's the same language that was used. The Herongate buildings are, you know, half as old as the one you live in, like built in the mid 60s around there. They're not, you know, they're not really that old, but the landlord has this discourse about, you know, reaching the end of their life cycle, these buildings. As well, the transit-oriented development too. Yeah, I think that's not unique to Vancouver. People are really interested in and anticipating a lot of harm coming out of that, and, you know, people trying to do research around that as well. And yeah, you're right. There's no incentive there's no incentive. The goal is to tear down. Ultimate goal is to tear down. There's no incentive. So I guess one interesting thing too is like learning about. We're trying to do this with another anticipated dem eviction in the Ottawa areas. Learn about kind of the sequences of property standards and neglect of buildings, and try to it's one way we can understand the municipal role in you know, either in ensuring that the fulfilling their mandate of keeping buildings maintained, and then we see the landlord manipulating those processes as well. Anyway, it's one way that we can do research. So yeah, I think we can't let governments off the hook, and this, you know, and that includes municipal governments. So yeah, we tend to focus on provincial and federal, but municipal governments are, you know, are kind of greenlighting these projects. That's a major reason why the coalition has included the city of Ottawa in its efforts. You know, they see the trying to draw the connections between the municipal officials, planners, and you know, trying to it's like kind of like the idea of financialization. It's hard to understand. I still don't have my head wrapped around it, even though I've written about it. I'm still trying to learn more. But same with how urban planning and the development process works in municipalities. I think it's important to understand. It's not always the most exciting thing, but important to kind of understand those processes. And taking lead from tenants, like the coalition, really including the city in their campaign of understanding the actors, complicit actors. And even the city of Ottawa was even named on that human rights case, originally named on that human rights case that's before the Ontario Tribunal. I think I'll pass it off. Thanks, though.
Would you like to go next, Ricardo, or Vince, or AJ, whoever would like to jump in? Just to, again, the prompt is just a response to everyone's remarks. What's really alive for you?
Yes, for me, where my head is right now is again on that city of municipal governments as enablers of these processes, and how so much of the so-called progressive debate on housing right now is supporting densification. And there are some good reasons to support densification in some places. But I just see this kind of nefarious coalition now and consensus around the need for more supply everywhere and anywhere. And the entire thing, it's so acritical. And from kind of a one perspective, more problematically, I think it has made very difficult for any municipal elected official to stand on the way of development. It is a political suicide right now. I find it's quite telling at the city of Toronto, through a lot of, through a lot of political work, folks in the York Southwest and Tenant Union, who are on strike now with for 5 buildings now, managed to get Mayor Lida Shaw to come and sit with them, and then eventually she came up publicly and she asked the landlord Dream Impact to sit at the table with the tenants and negotiate an end to the strike. And Dream Impact's answer was like, "No, thanks," and they simply didn't show up and refused to meet with the mayor of Toronto. And only months later, the mayor was in some fireside chat with representatives of Dream Impact. So that's sort of the amount of power and influence the developers have right now. That's what kind of we're up against. And that discourse, pro-supply, pro-densification, inclusionary zoning, although in some places justifiable, overall sort of just support. And I think Vince provided us a very clear example. I got to walk through your neighborhood with Mazdak a couple months ago, and he showed me exactly, the dynamics of it physically. So it was kind of like hearing you was great to have that visual. And then Andy provided some language to that. Never mind that, like, the economist kind of mindset in me is talking about all the wealth creation that's going to happen through these rezonings, that we're not even talking about how to potentially, like, the state capture of that newly generated wealth for social use. But yeah, that's kind of what my mind went a little bit. The fact that we have this enormous, somewhat consensus around this, and then how dangerous that is.
Yeah, maybe if I may, I think, yeah, the centrality of the state for me is, something that dawns on me day by day in this kind of process, especially when it comes to enforcement, right? Because, I mean, I haven't, maybe it's just personal stuff. I haven't been in as many like REIT fights, which is, you're against a multinational shadowy capital interest, which employs all these like private contractors to essentially, as described in this book, like try to suppress a movement. But nonetheless, it's like it comes down to when it comes to the ultimate structure of liberal democracy and the proprietarian regime, who's enforcing that is the state. It is the police. It's the guys with the guns. And I think actually one of the stories in this I was most impressed by was about the bombing of Heron Gate, where so if you guys haven't read the book, there's a crazy anecdote in here where once they do the first round of demevictions in Heron Gate, the police take it upon themselves after an offer from the developer to use the emptied houses for training for urban combat and like essentially tactical units like blowing up walls, much like the IDF does, much like the Israeli Defense Force loves to do, is destroy homes and smash walls and walk through walls and so on and so forth. Is like, yeah, the ultimate function of state repression, which I think connects it back to the kind of colonial roots of this entire problem, is very important to, yeah, the centrality of the state, whether it comes to, the primary logic, which I think is elaborated a lot in Sam Stein's Real Estate State, or sorry, yeah, Capital City of the Real Estate State, where, effectively the entire municipal government complex depends on development through tax revenues to continue to function. And that is like, the result of a long period of, essentially downloading and devolving housing responsibility and functions from the federal government to the municipalities. I think that's covered in another book that's referenced in Andy's book, which is Still Renovating, which is about social housing policy in Canada. That's also very useful to understand the kind of long kind of durée of all of this. So yeah, the state has an interest. This is essentially its only function, whether it's the city councillor, the mayor themselves. Their entire role is to shake hands with developers in order to keep the city going, right? And so it's actually really difficult to change that logic as long as the cities are built and continue to grow this way, right? What Ricardo was talking about, has also been theorized as a growth coalition, that consensus between media, between, so-called expert classes, professionals like economists, think tank people, academics, and then, government interests, and then obviously private actors all speak in the same voice, which is the inevitability of growth, right? Which is like, fundamental to capitalism, fundamental to the colonial project. And these are very hard logics to, completely dissemble, especially with just some, progressive ideas, right? Which is why I completely agree as well with, what comes out of this as well, which is the Heron Gate Tenant Coalition, their active refusal. They're just being like, we're not going to participate in any of this. And that's, I've been part of formations where we've been invited to tables and we refuse because we know that whatever comes next is essentially planning your own demise. And that comes a lot on the downtown east side, right? Invitations to help consult on your own annihilation. So it's like, that strategy of refusal to participate in any of these processes, I completely understand. But when it comes to actually resisting them, that's a whole other question, which I think is still being theorized as we fight together, which is why this book is very important, because we need to theorize this stuff as we fight and continue to revise and think of new tactics and strategies. Because ultimately, this is it's one of those things that I feel, especially in a place like Vancouver, is like coming for a lot of people, right? So whether it's the transit stuff, well, actually, it's primarily transit stuff for me, because even by the city's own metrics, this transit development plan is going to affect, I think the last number I saw was about like 60% of all renters and all Vancouver, which like by effect means displaced, right? Like that is the euphemism here. And so that the mass scale of this, of this displacement. Also, I think the really key thing to note here is that it's not like previous generations of urban renewal, which were primarily state-led, that just said, hey, this block is going to go away and it's primarily brown people and we're going to put some other housing on top of it. And all happened at once. That type of urban renewal, I think the state had learned a lot of lessons about the kind of resistance that comes out of it when you try to destroy a whole neighborhood at once. And we've seen it happen here in Chinatown, in Hogan's Alley, here in Vancouver. That, if you try to destroy a whole place all at the same time, it creates a lot of resistance. But if you allow the market to just slowly do that on its own by creating essentially, and this is what the state does, it creates these plans that allow non-state actors, private interests, to slowly displace people on their own terms. It stops people from being able to connect to each other through this massive plan, right? If you allow the market to just do its thing, it'll take one building over here, one over here, one over here, one over here until everyone's gone. It's harder to build a resistance movement to that. And that's why I think, again, trying to build a bigger analysis and how to understand, through a book like this, how the state interacts with developers to create these plans, is really important for formulating strategy on our side. So those are some lessons that I thought about. AJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I think everyone has had so many good points. And I think that the book, as people pointed out, shows just how devastating housing can be, building housing can be, which isn't how we really think about housing. And the book doesn't talk about this, but it's really useful for showing how devastating building housing can be for unhoused people, which I don't think people think about a lot, but Vince was sort of pointing to, like in the downtown east side, the building of housing will lead to the mass displacement of unhoused people. It increases the violent response to people because of gentrification. So when we hear that we need supply, we do in some ways need supply. But this idea of like the missing middle without any kind of affordability is paradoxically in some ways, or like doesn't make sense, but it is devastating to low income folks. And I think that that's on purpose. There used to be a bigger discourse around affordability. The city of Toronto has recently changed its definition of affordable housing because everyone's like, affordable is not affordable. And people fought for the definition of affordable housing to change, and it brought in a fairly good, in many senses, definition of affordable housing, except for that definition is specifically designed to always and forever exclude people on welfare. People on welfare will never be able to afford affordable housing. People on disability benefits will be able to afford affordable housing. And that division of deserving and undeserving poor is so stark. And if you're on welfare and you lose your housing in almost any city in this country, you're done, you're homeless. Because in most cities, you cannot get a place. Like you have to stay where you are at any cost. And as housing gets built more and more, that pressure becomes bigger and bigger on people who are on social assistance and people who are at the bottom end of the income bracket. And so, yeah, gentrification just continues to eat people alive. And it's really brutal.
Yeah, thank you all for picking up on those threads and bringing them back for us. Maybe the question I'll pose to you all before we stop the recording and then move to a more audience-oriented Q&A is really I'm really picking up on this language of use that you flagged, Ricardo, of fight that both Vince and AJ you picked up on, right? Like, this is an important book that people will take and use to fight people. All of you are oriented towards housing and towards what's going on in a desire to change the trajectory that capitalism has put us on. So I guess my question is what do you see as useful action? What do you see as the tools to take to the fight? how do we kind of lift from our own conversation even here for everyone who's in the audience, some like tangible takeaways, if I could ask that of you all, which huge asterisks, because like it's a question that I think we will repeat and return to in many ways, but that's really coming up for me. Look, please feel free to take it in whatever direction feels best.
Should we keep going in order? I can go first, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah, this is a really great conversation, and I'm part of kind of diverse conversations around housing in the country, policy, like macro policy level, and then kind of on the ground stuff. And I just I think I can relate to my colleagues here. It's like there's I don't have a lot of faith in that the macro actors, the state is really invested in kind of attending to this purported housing crisis, this crisis that materializes in the settler colonial capitalist state. So I don't see many hopeful solutions in, like, for example, a national housing strategy in the federal level, or whatever different provinces are cooking up, and then municipalities, which we've talked about. So I mean, I think that we've seen in different mobilizations, across this country is, tenants have had enough. Vince talked really eloquently about kind of this social contract between, like, landlord and tenant that's kind of mediated through landlord tenant tribunals, and they exist in various forms, similar forms in every provincial and territorial jurisdiction. But so getting back, like, thinking about that, and then going to this kind of this praxis of refusal, if you will, so refusing, and it doesn't always lead to great victories. It's hard it's kind of difficult to tell the story in Herongate, because the big mobilization in 2018 was the sole purpose, coming from the grassroots organizing in the community, was to keep people in their homes. That's the ultimate goal. There's all this, and talking a bit about this, but there's all these other types of actors, peripheral and in the community and around, that are all trying to negotiate a gentler form of expulsion, or demoviction. But ultimately, I think the power of what the coalition was doing was ultimate refusal and trying to keep people in their homes. And it's really risky, and it's frightening. And the landlord, the landlord used a lot of tactics. So it is important to document what these actors are doing, their financial structures, but also their how they're kind of organizing themselves in the face of tenant resistance. So they ran a fear campaign against tenants there to scare them into leaving. It's like, no, if you stay, then there'll be dire consequences if you don't move out by the date that we asked you to move out, type thing. So and this is, I'm not going to prescribe anything to any situation, just my observations. But this kind of idea of refusal could be effective. Frightening for sure, but the coalition was arguing, if these over 100 households do not move, you cannot really be compelled to move. Like, what's going to happen? Like, they will have to go to the landlord or tenant board to get eviction orders, and then what's going to happen? You're going to bring in bus loads of sheriffs to physically, forcibly evict that many households. I mean, so I don't know. I'm not gonna say, and I really appreciate AJ's point on this. I'm not going to come in. I don't know the answers. I can just observe what's happened here. But I think I really appreciate this mobilizing around refusing. It doesn't always lead to victories, but that's where I'm falling behind. Yeah. So I'll pass it off, Ricardo.
So where my mind is these days, and it has a lot to do with kind of where I operate in my day job, is with resource mobilization. The need to find resource, the need to inject resources, money, and other forms of resources that could help with more organizing and more fighting, essentially. And I say that has to do with where I am sort of on my day job, because I just see an enormous amount of time, energy, and resource wasted every single day in engaging with these official government processes, the consultation for the framework for the strategy that requires a framework for a consultation, and this just kind of policy merry-go-round that leads to absolutely nothing year after year. And people continue to hope that now it's going to be the next strategy, it's going to be the next budget, the next fiscal economic update, and so on and so forth. And if it was all just delusional and wishful thinking from people who mean well and then kind of hope that one day things will get better, that would be fine. But the problem is that it actually, sucks resources out of other potential venues for engagement, more direct action, more targeted fighting. And so that social movement literature that neither Jay and I particularly love or find useful, one thing that comes out of that literature, that is one of the lessons that comes out of that literature, it is the importance of resources, and how sometimes in the history of certain movements and social movements or resisting movements, the injection of resources had a positive impact. Of course, there are always a tricky question of if it's resources coming from outside, we respect the autonomy and the direction that the people directly engaged are taking, right? So there's always that the risk, but assuming that it does, which is what would be required for all the points raised here, it could make I think it could make a positive change. I'm just closely watching, and to the extent that I can, trying to support the rent strikes in Toronto, and just to see like how little they have to go with, how much personal an individual sacrifice it's happening just to keep this strike going, whereas so many other progressive civil society organizations are using resources to participate in a poverty reduction strategy consultation with the Ford government, right? And I was like, oh man, fuck me, like seriously, is that how you're going to use your money and your time, right? And then to see the amount of money that labor has, labor who should understand, how difficult it is to organize on the ground, and how absolutely fundamental that is to any fight, to see, how much resource they have, and that they're not, with the strikes in Toronto, there are some unions that came through it and provided some ad hoc support, but broadly speaking, labor is not in the picture here, for a number of reasons that should be another conversation for another day. But anyways, that's where my head is right now. Like how do we find that? How do we kind of galvanize those resources?
Okay, so I'll try to be quick because I know that we're at the end of our time here. I think much like Andy, I don't have a prescription. I don't know what the right thing to do is, but I think where AJ and Andy's book were kind of pointing towards is to really emphasize the leadership of the people being evicted, and just seeing what comes out of that. If you support that work, the tactics, the strategy, even the theory will emerge from that front, right? And I think that that's maybe a more meta argument here, where much like what Ricardo was saying, the housing crisis, as is talked about in mass media, is so abstracted, right? It's like it's a policy debate between, you know, professional economists, professional XYZ, and like, you know, policymakers, you know, people with big degrees or whatever, arguing it out about, you know, the supply, and not even to say that supply is should be questioned, but just ways in which supply should be delivered. And even from the left, I gotta say, like, you know, our left think tanks, like, they're saying the same thing. They're like, yeah, we need more supply, and displacement, or those are the eggs you gotta crack to make an omelet, right? And so I think when it comes to that, it really, one, it has material effects. One, it kind of distances the housing crisis. It creates an idea of the housing crisis as primarily a technocratic issue, like a puzzle that has to do with financing and land use, blah, blah, blah. All these things are inhuman, alienated ways of thinking about my home specifically. And so the more that we can, you know, books like this redraw the housing crisis, which is as actually an eviction crisis, as a tenants' rights crisis, and relocates it to what I would call, like, you know, point zero, right? Where it's like, where is the housing crisis, if we call it a crisis, reproduced day by day? It's on the street, in a tent, when a police officer walks by a tent, you know, or when someone is evicted, right? That's the point zero. And that's where people can start to understand themselves as part of this fight, and not as part of this, like, you know, abstract discussion about supply with big numbers that I can never understand without, like, various degrees. No, instead, it's something me resisting my own eviction from my community with my neighbors at point zero. You know, like that politics of refusal, that ultimate, you know, what I would say, the hell no, we won't go. That's a very powerful narrative. And one that actually re-engages the subject of the fight in it, which is me as a tenant, or me as a guy who's getting evicted, right? And I think the more we can, you know, rethink housing as not a question of supply and demand and blah, 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 but rather as like human beings resisting their destruction and domicide, that's an important shift that needs to happen in the long term. And then the one last thing that I'll say as well is that there was something very powerful that was brought in a kind of like the you know, centering Andy's book around the colonial analysis, is the, you know, this like long-term settler complex of like wanting to have property in the end. And that's still so drilled into everyone's head, you know, as AJ brought up in that really, you know, a nice dissection of the introduction. Like, that's something that also needs to be deconstructed and thrown away in the long term if we're going to have any gains. Because as long as there's going to be some, you know, fraction of the tenants that believe that, you know, they're going to get property in the end and become a good settler, we're not going to get anywhere, right? And if anything, the thing that I will say as a non-white person is that it was very important to, you know, center whiteness and white supremacy in the remaking of settler society. But I will say the greatest invention of the capitalist class is a multiracial capitalist class. Like, the ways in which, especially in Vancouver, and this is my perspective from Chinatown, that a white developer was removed from the, let's say, the fight in this 105 Kiefer fight that I took part in years ago, where we were trying to kind of get a developer to not build a gigantic condominium in Chinatown. That was a successful fight. It took about 5 years to get that guy out. But the thing is, who swooped in instead? It was a Chinese developer, a local Chinese developer. Her name was Carol Lee. She's the daughter of a gigantic real estate magnate here in Vancouver. And she came in with a bunch of other Chinese capitalists. And we're like, hey, okay, we'll take over the gentrification thing. And that has been a wonderful, it has worked out tremendously for them, for the capitalist class, to invent essentially a, you know, racial component of it, right? And so what you see that here in Vancouver, Chinatown, you're gonna see it in Hogan's Alley, you're gonna see it in the Senat developments, you're gonna see it all over, where it's not just going to be a white settler kind of you know, idea of like remaking and gentrifying neighborhoods, but you're going to see these boutique versions of it, led by different fractions of the developer class that actually can, you know, overcome some of these contradictions and find a way out of it, ultimately with the same end of, you know, destroying entire neighborhoods and suppressing a, you know, let's say like lower class racialized community. You're going to see that happen a lot, right? So that's the one thing that I toss out there for our audience today to keep an eye on. That's something that's really going to happen a lot more in the future. AJ, your turn.
Thanks, Vince. So it hasn't been said and because I think we take it for granted, but just to say it, the housing crisis is not caused by international students and temporary foreign workers. The shelter crisis in Toronto is not caused by refugees, and both of those are racist scapegoating. The housing crisis, like Lynn said, is so much more than that, and it's so easy to just blame supply or blame people of color and blame the foreigner. We've seen it over and over again. I think that the politics of refusal is a really good starting point. I also think that we have to build, like, not like build supply in that way, but like we do need affordable, meaningfully affordable, deep welfare rate or rent geared to income housing that people can actually live. And one of the things that I've learned from social movement theory is that poor people's movements are almost always restricted to the local level. And that's largely about resources. But there's a whole bunch of reasons why, where people usually get stuck at the municipal level. And the municipal level isn't going to build social housing. It's not going to build any kind of housing. That happens at the federal level. And I've heard from people all over the place about how folks recognize that there's the need for cross-jurisdictional organizing. And it just never happens, and that doesn't happen for a whole bunch of reasons, and a lot of it is because communities are in crisis and they respond at the local level to their emergencies, and people are stuck in this kind of cycle. Another reason that it doesn't happen is because we actually don't have the means to even speak to each other. So I've only recently realized that using the language of social housing like we do in Toronto and calling for the demand of social housing is actually infuriating to people in Vancouver, because social housing is bullshit here. It just means 30% is for people that are making $60,000 or less. And so when people are like, let's get together and fight for social housing, folks in Vancouver are like, you reformist, classist piece of shit. So sorry for my language, but so even just figuring out how to talk to each other is an important starting point, and I don't know how to do that, but I think we have to, starting with refusal is really important, and going beyond that, and ultimately, like we have to overthrow settler colonialism and capitalism, and those are the only places that we can actually have justice here is decolonizing.
Thank you so much for that, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and stop the recording now as we transition to the audience Q&A portion.